Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Pod is Cast. This episode, I'm going to be talking about the Nazi who worked for the Mossad. His name is Otto Skorzeny, and he's the closest thing our world has ever come to a real-life James Bond villain, coupled with the face scar, evil Nazi money, and everything else. So, Otto Skorzeny was born in 1908 to a wealthy Austrian family. He had a great childhood, was well educated. By the time he was 15, he was fluent in French, German, and English. And he really enjoyed fencing. In fact, it was his main passion at that time. So while fencing one of his friends, he got cut across the face. And this is where he develops a really distinctive face scar that runs the length of the right side of his face. It's the first step in his life to being the quintessential James Bond villain. So after Skorzeny went to college, he wanted to be a civil engineer. But he thought this was too boring after a couple of years and decided to join the Luftwaffe to serve Hitler because he was a diehard Nazi. He actually got turned down from the Luftwaffe because he was 6'4", 200-something pounds, and he was 31 years old. So he was too big, too old, and too tall for the Air Force. He instead joined the Waffen-SS and became an officer in the Leibstandarte SS Hitler, which was the honorary bodyguard regiment of Hitler. They weren't actually a bodyguard regiment, they were a normal Waffen-SS combat regiment, but they had the distinction of being Hitler's favorite, pretty much. For those of you who don't know what the SS is, they're essentially the most die-hard, evil, and most experienced combat soldiers that the Nazis had. So when Hitler rose to power, he had a man named Ernst Röhm start this thing called the SA. They were a bunch of brown shirts, and they were his street thugs and bodyguards. Later on, a disgraced chicken farmer named Himmler also came to power in the Nazi Party and splintered off in the SA. So they're really, the SS is a zealous splinter group of the SA. And to prove their undying loyalty to Hitler in the Night of the Long Knives, the SS assassinated and or captured most of the SA leaders, establishing themselves as the dominant German political faction, or like bodyguard political faction. A couple years later, Himmler, always vying for power, created the Waffen-SS, so an armed branch of the SS. Really, these guys were the most zealous soldiers of the war. Their combat stories are legendary because they would hold off entire Russian divisions, but at the same time, these are the guys that helped run the camps. So they're extremely evil, but extremely good soldiers, and perfect for Otto Skorzeny. So Skorzeny ended up fighting in Holland and Belgium and the Low Countries early in the war. He participated in the initial blitzkrieg of the invasion of France, and then got moved east to prepare for Operation Barbarossa, the planned invasion of Russia in 1941. He fought on the Eastern Front against the Russians until 1942, when he got wounded by some artillery, and a piece of shrapnel struck him in the head. He got hospitalized, and this is where, kind of in boredom, he started reading about guerrilla warfare. Initially, he started reading books about the first time that guerrilla warfare is called this. It's the Spanish fighting against Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars, and that's where they coined the term guerrilla warfare, literally little war. And he became more interested in this. So he eventually started reading more and more about the British commando operations, and he became convinced that was the way that Nazi Germany would win the war. So he pitched this idea of a German commando unit to his superiors, and they really liked it. They thought it was a great idea, and he was able to move up through the ranks where he participated in his first mission in 1943. So he was able to put together, within a year or two, he was able to put together his own special forces, essentially. It's called the Waffen Sonderverband ZBV Friedenthal. Got renamed to Jagdverband F502 SS. They're essentially SEAL Team 6 of the SS. And his first operation is called Operation Francois, and what they were supposed to do, and what they actually did do successfully, was parachute into Iran and meet up with guerrilla groups there to instigate guerrilla warfare against the Allies who were occupying it. Unfortunately for them, they couldn't ever get enough supplies, really any supplies, into Iran, and so the guerrilla groups just abandoned their plan, and Skorzeny got away. In 1943, he came to prominence, especially in the eyes of Hitler, when he rescued Benito Mussolini from a mountaintop hotel. So Mussolini, as soon as the Allies invaded Sicily and word got back to mainland Italy, they immediately surrendered and overthrew Mussolini. Mussolini was then imprisoned on top of a mountain in this, it's a very cool looking hotel, but it was supposed to be his informal prison. Skorzeny took a bunch of gliders and parachute infantrymen, Fallschirmjägers, and they landed on top of this mountain. It was like a 60-foot runway that they had. It wasn't even a runway, it was actually just rocks on an incline. But, I mean, it was their runway. So after an initial bumpy landing, they rushed out, overwhelmed the guards, who I think at this point were just so in awe of what had just happened that they didn't even put up resistance. And they carried Mussolini out. There's pretty famous film footage of it. Mussolini was in a black suit and a hat, and he's being carried out to a stork plane, where they then take off from this tiny runway, and Mussolini was rescued. So because of that, Skorzeny was given the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. It's essentially the German Medal of Honor. So it's the biggest, most prestigious award that he could win during World War II. Hitler then gave Operation Long Jump to him. Now, Operation Long Jump is a little controversial because some historians don't believe it actually existed. And that's because it was a plan to kill Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt at the Tehran Conference. So the story goes that Hitler wanted to kill the big three. So he gives this plan to Skorzeny, who says that it's really plausible and, in fact, possible. And the plan goes that German spy teams are to fly into Tehran posing as tourists, where they'll set up a spy network and smuggle in an assassination team, presumably led by Skorzeny in person. After the assassination team is smuggled into Iran, they would wait for the conference and assassinate the big three. Now, the Russians supposedly found out about this and thwarted the plan, which is why a bunch of historians think that the Soviets made it up. And actually it would make sense, because they make up a lot of things like this. It's another example of Soviet propaganda trying to show how they saved the West. Or is it? I actually disagree with most historians here, and I think it was real. And that's because a bunch of Soviet generals and officers ended up writing about this later on. And the high-level Soviet documents that got declassified when the Soviet Union fell reflect that the Soviets were genuinely shaken by this. They were really scared of how close the Germans actually came to assassinating Stalin. The Soviets are pretty tough, and so when they got shaken about something, especially like this, it leads me to believe that, in fact, Operation Long Jump may not be a myth, and is in fact, was probably an actual planned operation. He had a few other ones. He had Operation Night Sleep, that's trying to capture Joseph Tito. Operation Armored Fist, that's where he... Okay, so Hungary was trying to surrender. They were a German ally, kind of by force. They didn't want to be. They knew that they would lose the war, but Germany put a gun to their head and said, join us in the fight. Near the end of the war, as Soviet forces closed in, Skorzeny realized Well, the Germans realized that Hungary was about to surrender. So Skorzeny got permission from Hitler to go in and capture the head of Hungary's son and hold him hostage so that the head of the state, his name was Miklos Horthy, would step down and let the Aerocross Party, it's a Hungarian fascist group, come to power. It did, it worked, and then within a year, less than a year actually, in a couple months, everything had fallen apart and Hungary was taken over. Pretty useless operation, just another example of last-ditch German efforts. Now, arguably Skorzeny's most successful infiltration came in late 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. He was part of something called Operation Griffin. So he took his already elite SS division, and every day he had them watch 3 hours of propaganda and 2 hours of English and American movies to hone their English skills. So at the end of a couple months, they were completely fluent in English, they had all the nuances of the Americans down, and they dressed up in American uniforms. They then got into American jeeps and vans and drove across enemy lines and started turning around signs. They started blowing up bridges, they started sabotaging roads, they started killing MPs, and they really created a lot of havoc. So during the initial punch through the Ardennes force, where the Germans broke through and were trying to push towards Antwerp, the Americans were caught off guard, number one, and number two, when they tried to respond, they found a bunch of blown bridges and sabotaged roads and turned around signs, and there were all these rumors of Germans dressed up like Americans. Skorzeny even had his men say that their real plan was to assassinate Eisenhower. So then Eisenhower was whisked away and protected so that American forces couldn't effectively counterattack for a couple of weeks. Eventually, we know that the Battle of the Bulge went the American way, and by January 1945, any kind of hope for the Germans was over. They had expended the last of their reserves and reinforcements and poured them into this fever dream that they could punch through to Antwerp. After the war, Skorzeny got captured, and he was put on trial for using U.S. uniforms to impersonate U.S. soldiers. In fact, he was so successful that Omar Bradley, one of the top U.S. generals, was asked for his ID just to be sure he wasn't a German. So the Americans were thoroughly embarrassed and thoroughly pissed, and they wanted Skorzeny's head. Unfortunately, there was a British soldier who had done essentially the same thing, and Skorzeny used this as a defense, saying that, in fact, it wasn't outside of the laws of war, and it was a completely legal thing to do as one combatant to another. The U.S. had to let him go. But they put him in prison and then realized the OSS, so this is the predecessor to the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services, realized how useful he would be. And so, in 1948, 3 SS officers dressed up like MPs walked into Skorzeny's camp and said that they needed him to take to Nuremberg to be a witness. MPs handed Skorzeny over, and then they escaped to Bavaria, where they hid out in a farm for a year and a half. Allegedly, he wrote that the OSS supplied those uniforms and helped him escape. And considering how many Nazis the US used after the war, especially like NASA, the reason we got to the moon and have ICBMs is because we used a bunch of Nazi scientists after the war. So I completely believe this. The CIA ended up having him help out with a few missions, mostly just intelligence and capturing higher-level Nazis. And they ended up using one of his co-workers, Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, to hunt down and kill Che Guevara. So just in case you guys didn't know, the CIA was using Nazi SS and elite soldiers to hunt down other Nazis. By 1950, Skorzeny was wealthy and living in Spain, and was a military advisor to Mohammed Naguib of Egypt, where he and General Reinhard Gehlen and a few other Nazis were military advisors to Egypt. And they ended up training the Egyptian army with a bunch of former SS soldiers and officers. He liked this so much that he ended up becoming an advisor to President Nasser. On top of that, he was also running a fake company out of Spain that would help smuggle Nazis to Argentina and other parts of Latin America. So he was traveling from Spain to Argentina to Egypt on a regular basis, smuggling Nazis, getting fabulously wealthy, and being a military advisor to Egypt, while trying to start what he called the Fourth Reich in Latin America. He was a close friend of Juan Perón, president of Argentina, and was his bodyguard and alleged lover of his wife, Eva Perón. And he did this for 10 years, and that was until 1962. So while in Spain, he's at a bar with his wife, and the bartender takes him down to the other end and introduces him to this German couple. The man is in his 40s, the woman is in her 20s. They're having a nice time, and they actually decide that they're going to go back to Skorzeny's house and have sex with each other. So they go back to the house, and as Skorzeny's getting drinks, the couple's sitting down on a couch. They have a bar, so Skorzeny's got his back to the couple, and he's pouring drinks. And then he turns around with a Luger and says, "I know who you are. You're with Mossad, and you're trying to kill me." And the man calmly says, "You're half right. We are from Mossad, but if we had come to kill you, you would have been dead a long time ago." So Skorzeny says, "Okay, well then I'll just kill you now." To which the Mossad girl says, "If you kill us, the ones who come next won't bother to have a drink with you. You won't even see their faces before they blow out your brains. Our offer to you is just for you to help us." So Skorzeny agrees. And so the Mossad agents offer to pay him, which he turns down. He says, "I have enough money. What I really want is for Wiesenthal to take my name off the list of Nazi war criminals to be hunted down by the Mossad." And they say, "We'll do it. We'll take care of that." So now Skorzeny is working for the Mossad, which is the Israeli intelligence service that gained notoriety in its early years by hunting down, a lot of times killing, and otherwise capturing and bringing to justice these horrible Nazi war criminals. But for some reason, a man named Joe Ronan, who was a high up in the Mossad, he's actually got his own pretty interesting story. He was a fighter pilot with the British during World War II, and one of the original pilots for Israel during its War of Independence in 1948. The Arab-Israeli War in 1948. I say independence, but it's really solidifying their place as a sovereign state. Awesome story. I'll have to do another podcast on that if I want to get into it, about the original fighter pilots for Israel. Anywho, Skorzeny gets taken to Israel, where he meets up with his new spy master, Ronan, and they actually go to the Holocaust Museum in Israel, where Skorzeny is recognized, and the Mossad has to come up with a cover story of who he is. He's then given his target. For a little background, Egypt had gone similar to the route of the United States and hired a bunch of former Nazi scientists to build rockets for them. And one of these men was named Krug. So Krug had actually turned down an opportunity to work for NASA, instead wanting to continue the legacies of Hitler and try and wipe out all the Jews. And what better way than to build rockets and missiles for Egypt? So Krug was working in Egypt. He was the head of their missile program, and he kept getting these menacing calls and threats from the Mossad saying that we know who you are, we know where you are, and we're coming to kill you. All of a sudden, he gets a message from Otto Skorzeny, well-known Nazi to him. So he feels comfortable. He feels like this man is coming to save him and that Skorzeny will help smuggle him out. So they meet up, and Skorzeny puts him in the back of his car, and they drive around. He's telling him all these opportunities that await him, and that they're being tailed, so they need to go hide out in the forest to continue this conversation. As soon as they get out of the car, Skorzeny pulls out a pistol, shoots Krug in the back of the head, and a bunch of Mossad agents pour acid on the body, bury it, and cover it with lime so the Egyptians won't ever be able to find it with body-sniffing dogs. And then Skorzeny's gone. Now, the interesting thing is that Wiesenthal actually never did take him off the wanted Nazi list, and the Mossad couldn't get him to agree to it. So instead, they forged a letter from him saying that Skorzeny's name had been taken off, and they gave it to Skorzeny. So he thought he'd gotten away with it, when in reality, the Mossad had pretty much just given him a head start, and they were going to come hunt him down again. Now, his story doesn't end there. When he got back to Spain, he set up a company. It had actually been set up a few years earlier, but he really made it known, and that was called the Paladin Group. So he envisioned this, and this is his quote, as an international directorship of strategic assault personnel that would straddle the watershed between paramilitary operations carried out by troops in uniform and the political warfare which is conducted by civilian agents. It's a neo-Nazi group. If we're going to be completely honest here, he just set up a new neo-Nazi group. It's pretty disgusting, but that's not where the actual Bond villain comes in. That's where he takes a bunch of Nazi gold out of Austria and sets up a secret organization called Die Spinne, the Spider, where he helped high-ranking former SS men escape all around the world and set up political influence. Allegedly, Europe and Latin America in the 1970s had heavy influence by men that were part of the Spider. If that isn't the closest thing to a Bond villain, I don't know what is. He's absolutely a true-life James Bond villain. Let's go over how he is. He's wealthy, fabulously wealthy, in fact. Evil Nazi, who's giant and has a huge scar running down his face. He's in charge of a secret organization called the Spider with influence all over Latin America and Europe. Unfortunately, unlike a Bond villain, he wasn't assassinated. He simply died of lung cancer. That was it. The Mossad were never able to get close to him again, or maybe they just didn't want to, because he had done work for them in eliminating the Egyptian missile program. And he was buried, actually cremated, and then paraded around Europe in 1975. One story I forgot to mention, this just came back to me. One other thing he did for the Israelis was he sent a bunch of bombs. He mailed a bunch of bombs to German scientists working in Factory 333. And they see these letters and packages from Otto Skorzeny, the supposed savior for them. So they open them up and then get blown sky high. So he killed pretty much every German scientist working on the Egyptian missile program. He was a diehard Nazi to the end. Truly evil, evil man. But there were Mossad agents at his funeral. In fact, his spy master attended the one in Madrid. So he had a funeral in Madrid, and then he had one in Austria, his home country. And there were Mossad agents at both that came to pay their respects. This story is totally fascinating to me. Especially the part where he turns around with a Luger and like, I know who you are. It's totally a real-life James Bond movie. I don't know why this hasn't been made into a movie yet, but if anyone listening is a producer, this should be your next project. Thank you guys so much for listening, and next episode, now I kind of want to talk about the Israeli Air Force, so that might be the next episode. Anyway, thank you guys so much for listening, and tune in to the next episode.